Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining City and State's discussion on a post-COVID Queens, what we've learned and what does the future look like. And this is, of course, an opportunity for all of you to make your pitch for why you should be the next owner of the New York Mets. So look forward to explaining that. And while I'm at it, I want to thank our sponsors, including the New York Mets. They're looking for an owner. So, just pay attention. Also, Northwell Health and Charter Spectrum. And on that note, I would like to briefly hand it over to the Vice President of Government Affairs at Charter Communications, Rodney Capel.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Thank you all for being here, and thanks City and State for their partnership. Over my shoulder, in my son's room, where I do all my video conferences, is a Queens native named Peter Parker. So we are in theme here in the Capel household. But it is an honor to be a part of this wonderful event today, honoring those who have really stepped up in real life and have gone beyond the call of duty in these challenging and uncertain times. In particular, I'm honored to represent Charter Communications, also known better to all as Spectrum, as the sponsor of this event. I think it's fair to say that 2020 has been like no other, a roller coaster we've all been going through, and has been dizzying throughout this entire year, particularly in Queens, where we are in the epicenter of the epicenter, really. And many of the work that you all have been doing, you guys are all heroes who are on this panel. And I've known that for many years, but to see it in real action is just a real pleasure to see. But amid the chaos and challenges, it's always comforting to look in the good of our lives to provide a bit of normalcy. And that's why you all have tuned in here today. And we're thankful for City and State for doing so. As we've seen countless times in crises, there's people and groups who step and run to the crisis. Those are our leaders, those are our heroes. And this event is aptly named for so. There are many companies that have been involved also in being helpful in this effort, fighting against the COVID-19 epidemic and pandemic. Companies who have given food banks. We have done a lot at Charter also to be of support to our communities. We've provided free internet offers for our new customers so that kids could take advantage of the social distance online learning. We gave $10 million for small targeted loans to the National Action Network and to the National Urban League to support minority-owned business. And we participated in the pledge of our country's Keep America Connected program. And our technicians, our workforce, stayed on the job to make sure that our customers were able to stay in contact and do the work and school that was needed. So in many ways, they were heroes for us through this process as well. And as we highlight the 50 Queens Power 50 tonight and the heroes, I want to give a special salute to Alex Camarda of my team, who's the Director of State Government Affairs, as well as our New York One stars, Shannon Ferry and Michelle Boone, who are also proud of the list. So I hope you all have a great evening. I know the panel is well educated about what is needed for us, not only from a city perspective, from the state and federal as well. And good luck to you this evening.
Thank you, Rodney. Yeah, definitely would want to particularly shout out our two lists this year. We did the Queens Power 50 as well as our Queens Heroes, which is a new list that's focusing on those Queens residents that really stepped up during the coronavirus pandemic. So you can check out both of those lists in the chat. But I'd also like to now talk to some of our Queens elected officials that are joining us here today. I'm going to let them introduce. Oh, you know what? I never introduced myself, by the way. I'm Jeff Colton. I'm a senior reporter at City and State. I have the sad disappointment to say I'm currently in Manhattan, but I've covered Queens for many years now. And I think it is truly the epicenter of New York politics right now. Queens is really where it's happening. There's so much interesting stuff going on. And we have four incredible elected officials here that can talk about all of that. So I'd like for them to introduce themselves, 1 minute each, briefly. If you could introduce yourself and start out on a high note, tell me what's one reason for optimism regarding the future of Queens. And I'll start with Congressman Meeks. Tell me what's one reason for being optimistic about the future.
Well, Queens is the best borough in the world. Why? We are the most diverse borough in all of these United States of America. We are the example that everyone else can follow. You know, we know how to work together. That's why I love the word, we are one Queens from many. You know, it's e pluribus unum. Well, that's what we are in Queens. From many, there's one. And I'm excited about it. And when you look at the energy in Queens, whether you're talking about from parks and recreational space to commercial space to development to affordable homes, we're doing it all. And we're doing it collectively together. By the way, I'm Greg Meeks. I'm a member of Congress from the 5th Congressional District, representing a large, mostly Queens and a little bit of Nassau County, which is very important to me also. I sit on the Foreign Affairs Committee as well as the Financial Services Committee, where I am currently the chair of the Committee on Consumer Protection and Financial Institutions. So I think that's about my 1 minute, right, Jeff? So I look forward to the opportunity to deal with my colleagues. I've got the best. That's the other reason why Queens. Who has a better DA than we have? Nobody. Who's going to have the best borough president than we have? We're going to have. We have now, but we're going to have also in starting in January. And my dear friend and colleague, who's also the vice chair of the DNC, who's the very best, Grace May. How can you not lose with the stuff that Queens has?
And with that, well, I should also ask, by the way, do you self-identify as a boss or more of a party leader? You know, you left out one part of your biography there.
I'm a party unifier. I'm not a boss. I'm a unifier. We bring people together. That's what we want. We have different ethnicities, different ideas. The party unifier.
Excellent. We'll talk more about that later. And as you introduced briefly, Congresswoman Grace Meng, if you can introduce yourself and give one reason for optimism in these difficult times.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Jeff, and thank you to City and State for having us on today. Look forward to being a part of this and many future discussions about how Queens and how this country will overcome this pandemic. You know what? Queens has really suffered. Queens had one of the highest death rates, not just in the state of New York, but throughout the entire country. But you know what? Because of the resilience, because of the diversity, because of the strengths of the people of Queens, everyday people, Queens is truly on the map. I have colleagues from all over the country, especially in March and April, and Greg knows this. They were praying for us. They knew Queens, they knew the hospitals in Queens, and they knew about the suffering that our families had gone through. And so because of that, we saw the true resilience of the people of Queens. Congress passed so far a lot of good legislation to help people, and we still have a lot more to do, especially the US Senate in passing the HEROES Act. And a lot of that legislation that came out to help people was legislated from the ground up, beginning right here in Queens. From the healthcare workers, the essential workers, the subway and bus operators who called us and told us what everyday families needed. We brought their voices directly to the leadership in Congress. And because of them being at the table, we were able to pass important legislation to help them. And we've seen a lot of areas for improvement too. And I think going forward, it'll help us to make sure we're working together to improve the qualities of their lives.
Thank you so much. And District Attorney Katz, over to you. You look like you're in a music video, by the way. I love seeing Queens go on.
You're about to see the Unisphere on the left. And yes, thank you, Jeff. Thank you, City and State, for bringing everyone together. I do want to thank my colleagues, you know, Congressmember Meeks and Meng, and of course our next, what I think is the next borough president, Donovan Richards, but does a great job as chair of public safety. You know, we were in the epicenter, and as the congressman said, just so you know for the record, there's 200 languages and 190 countries represented in Queens County. And during this pandemic, we were absolutely the epicenter of it. And with that, all our hospitals and our doctors and our nurses and our healthcare workers who were on the front lines, and many of whom you're honoring tonight. I know there's people from all different communities, hospitals, Jamaica Hospital, I know is represented. And they were the ones who were on the front lines and the workers. And we spoke to them quite often about what do you need? And we did have problems in the beginning as far as respirators go and how we're treating this virus and how we were going to move forward as a borough. And, you know, we were part of the 7 o'clock every day, stand outside and make noise for our healthcare workers to thank them. But, you know, Queens stood together. And I was, you know, I have a different role now than borough president. As the district attorney, you know, we had many choices to make. We did not prosecute for curfew violations. We didn't prosecute for social distancing violations. And I would never say we're not going to prosecute for protesting, because that is a First Amendment right. Everybody has a right to it. But you know, you have to look at what Queens did. Our religious organizations, our civic organizations, our housing tenant leaders really banded together to deliver food and make sure that people had sanitizers. And when masks were at a premium, and when people were trying to rip people off by selling masks at $10 a mask, you know, we all stood together and made sure that everyone had what they needed. Is it always perfect? It's never perfect. But there was this sense of belonging and this sense of, partnership that erupted from Queens County. And so I think we did learn a lot of lessons from it also. It's what we can withstand. And, you know, I say all this, by the way, not only as the district attorney, I'm a mother of 2 little boys who had to self-learn and use the, electronics and computers to learn every day instead of going to school. And everyone was facing very difficult times. So I think that we've learned a lot. I think that we showed how strong we are here in Queens County. I think we showed how we band together and what we're able to do. I do think the future is something we need to talk about, right? We have our kids going to school. How are we going to have care for children if people are working? When we open up, which percentage are we opening up? So there's a lot of questions, but Queens is tough. We stood together, band together, and we tried to do it in fairness and equity. That's 2 minutes.
Thank you so much. And finally, City Councilman, and I think it's fair to say presumptive Borough President, Donovan Richards. If you could introduce yourself and give us one reason for optimism in these difficult times.
Thank you, Jeff, and always great to be on with City and State. And let me thank all of my colleagues who really banded together truly during this pandemic, starting with my congressman. I know we talk every day at 3 o'clock. Today I had to miss because I had to march to attend out in the Rockaways, but it's really been an honor to work with each and every one of my colleagues, especially on this line on different issues, whether it was discrimination. I know Grace Ming and I did a town hall where we brought both the Black and Asian community together to talk about how do we come together during this period where we saw upticks in hate crimes. But this is a historic time, I think, in our history. When you look at everything that's been happening in Queens, and you know, obviously, I come from the Rockaways, a community that was very impacted, was impacted drastically by Hurricane Sandy, and we saw the goodness of New Yorkers during that moment in history. But to see what has happened during this moment in COVID, where just everyday Queens residents have banded together to feed their neighbors, to feed senior citizens, to do wellness calls. I mean, this moment, even although it's been a tough time, has really shown that Queens has some outstanding people who are ready to roll their sleeves up and get to work during a time like this. Another reason for optimism is we look at the Black Lives Movement right now in Queens. I mean, I saw people marching from Flushing to Forest Hills to Woodside to Southeast Queens who banded together to say, you know what? It is time that we address these inequities that have historically impacted the people in our boroughs, especially the communities that were disproportionately impacted during COVID, from Corona to Elmhurst to the Rockaways, where we saw over 1,000 people lose their lives. But it was really people coming together. And then lastly, I'll just touch on the growth that is potentially going to happen here from Long Island City to the Rockaways. I mean, Queens is hot. It's becoming a city amongst itself. But we have to make sure that even as that happens, that the people who've been here for a long time, who've labored through the toughest times, are the people who also can reap those benefits. So it's an exciting time to be in Queens, and nonetheless, great to be here as a borough president candidate. God willing, we'll have the final results next week, but I'm feeling good about bringing this borough together. So thank you, Jeff.
Thanks so much. And yeah, we'll definitely be asking about the elections later. But my understanding is that the district attorney won't be able to stay the whole time. So I do want to jump in quickly with a couple questions for you, DA Katz. Specifically looking at the future of the court system in the immediate future. Just recently, some public defender groups filed a lawsuit against the court system saying that the courts shouldn't be opened up yet fully again. Basically, that defendants can't be getting a fair trial if they have to be concerned about their health or that sort of thing. Wanted to ask your thoughts on that. You know, are you happy with the timeline for the courts reopening? And do you think that defendants can get a fair trial?
Thank you very much, Jeff. And I have till about 5:50, so I'm good. But I'll be happy to answer the question. You know, I have been a very large advocate of opening up the courts, getting back to business. I'll tell you how we've been doing it. And this is the problem. So you get arrested on a felony charge. You have a right to a grand jury. And as you know, one of the first things that I did as the district attorney is I got rid of a very onerous policy of the DA's office, which forced you to actually waive your right to a grand jury if you wanted to plead. Otherwise, you only had to get the top count. And I got rid of that. And so right now what's happening is that we're replacing grand juries with preliminary hearings. And they're just a different way of doing things. And then you get a grand jury in 45 days after that. So from my perspective, I think people have a right to a grand jury indictment if they're going to be held. We are at a point in this virus, at least right now. And the problem with the virus is you never know what happens tomorrow. But at least right now, restaurants are opening. We're talking about school in September. We see people who are doing some sports activities. I go to parks, you know, I see people that are going to work. Delicatessens are open. You're walking in there with masks. I think that we need to get back to business of the courts. I think that people are hanging with trials over their heads, with charges over their heads, and not being able to move forward on those. So what happens now is you have a hearing that's coming up. You know, if you're in, it's delayed a month. If you're not in, it's delayed 3 months. And I think you need to get back to work on those things. And in the meantime, people can't move forward. So yes, I am a proponent of opening the courts, but at the end of the day, it is OCA's judgment, and we will abide by that.
Thank you. And actually, well, I guess we'll stay on that subject for the moment. And really a question for all of the panelists is that right now the jail population at Rikers Island and New York City in general is at an absolute historic low, lower than it's been, I think, since 1960 or something like that. That said, in the past few weeks, we have seen an uptick in shootings and murders, still at historic lows. I mean, it's much lower than it was even 5 years ago, and yet there seems to be some real cause for concern. When we look at the future of Queens, whether that's next year or 5 years from now, can we expect to keep the jail population, incarcerated population, so low as it is now, or might there be an increase? Might we be incarcerating more people? And we can start with, I guess we'll start with the DA for that one, but really I'd like everybody to jump in.
So I'm looking for my numbers. So just so everybody knows, Jeff, exactly what you're talking about with the shootings. In 2019, year to date, there was 19, and in 2020, actually it's between May 14th and July 13th, there was 19 shootings in Queens. Over the last 2 months, there's 42. So we have grown exponentially, and it is a remarkable increase in numbers. Yes, the jail population is, I believe it's at 3,700 right now. About 500 of those are from Queens County, just so folks know. I think the new laws and the new way of looking at things, and I think a good way of looking at things is a different perspective. First of all, the shootings, if you know, we actually keep track of somewhat, I mean, in a sort of non-official way, if it's COVID released people who are actually committing a lot of these crimes. That's not what we're seeing from the shootings, just from a sort of a cursory look at it. My issue is that, you know, the population at Rikers shouldn't be that high in general. We have new bail laws that all misdemeanors and nonviolent felonies right now are getting ROR'd. I will tell you, in Queens County, even if you have a bailable offense, it's a qualifying offense. Out of all the qualifying offenses that I could put bail on, 75% of them are being released on their own recognizance or with supervised release. So there is a movement to also get to no bail at all, which, by the way, I'm a proponent of. And when I have the tools, I want to get there where you just aren't sitting in jail because you can't pay bail, where someone else can get out and have dinner with their families because they can afford it. Not a fair system. So we need to get there. I don't see a world myself where the Rikers population increases that much. At least we're not looking for it. But I think the more we ROR, the more we do supervised release, the better it's going to be, I think, for criminal justice reform. But you can't, you know, Jeff, you can't just do that alone. While you're doing that, and while we're making sure that we're not holding people when we don't have to be, we need to get to the kids and get to the youth and get to cure violence groups. You know, we have phenomenal cure violence groups in the borough of Queens County. You know, I'd start naming them, but I start getting in trouble. But, and also groups that help people get out of prison to make sure that they're not recidivisms. And I think that's an extremely important factor of it. You can't prosecute your way out of this problem of shootings. You need cure violence, you need workforce, you need mental health resources, you need drug rehabilitation. All of that has to come together. So as we prosecute those that are drivers of crime, you don't have the next generation just coming right on up in their spot. And you can only do that with community work also. So I think that we're in a good place to move on those issues. And I think that you can't really see a huge increase, at least I hope, not in the future.
And let me add on to that, Jeff. What we're at in a moment of time, you know, you asked about where you see Queens in the future. Will it be less? I think substantially even less. Because what we're talking about, we're at a moment in time of talking about ending disparities. You know, one of the things that happens when you talk about disparities, been disparities in education, disparities in opportunities, disparities in healthcare, and what we're talking about, you know, even though we're talking about having better policing. So when you have better policing and ending disparities, then you are preventing crime at the same time. So the police will be working with the community in a different way than what has been happening before. So that, number one, if someone gets out of the line, they've been working with the community knows the police, have respect for the police have respect for the community, so they work together. But we're creating and giving opportunities in communities, and that's what we're talking about, to create community centers and bring back PALs and make sure people have an opportunity to get the education they need so that they can have the training for good paying jobs so that they will be able to move in. That's how you reduce crime. So it's not just one way. So I see by doing this and the time that we're in right now, we're working not for right now, we're working for the future. You know, I often say, you know, and look at the progress that we make, and sometimes progress is slow. I talk about from the time I'm older than everybody here. I can remember when I grew up, for example, there was signs that said white and black when I went down south with my parents to visit my grandfather. My children who grew up in Queens can't even fathom that. And so I would hope that we're getting to a time and we're moving forward where the crime level goes down, just as well my grandchild will never see the reality of a black man having his life taken away by somebody with their knee on his throat. So I think we're headed, because of this moment of time that we're in, the camera of history going to mark us right now, and we'll be substantially better than we are now in 2, 3, 4 years.
Now I know there's so much more to talk about this topic, and yet we're almost already at our halfway point, so I'm sorry, but I've got to move on to some other things. In particular, Congressmember Meng, it's my understanding that you had a appropriations hearing today. Well, I think a lot of people are wondering, particularly those that work in government, what's the latest state of a government bailout? Federal funding. I mean, de Blasio has said that if more money doesn't come in, he may have to lay off 22,000 city workers. So what's the latest in Washington?
Well, we are still, it's been about, I think, almost 2 months where the House Democrats passed legislation commonly known as the HERO Acts that would go towards helping so many more New Yorkers and so many more Americans. For example, we're talking about stimulus payments that many New Yorkers, I think about 200,000 New Yorkers, couldn't even benefit from because they were possibly from a mixed status family or didn't have a social security number. And so we want to make sure that the Senate, Mitch McConnell, who is the Republican leader of the Senate, is doing what he can. You know, he said the other day that his members were coming back and they would start socializing the bill. I have no idea what that means. Just do your job, pass the bill. People are hungry. People can't pay their rent. People can't pay their mortgage. People have lost their jobs. There are New Yorkers who, as much as Congress has done, has not gotten any substantive help from Congress. And this help would come if Mitch McConnell would just pass the HEROES Act. This week, I'm in Washington this week because our appropriations hearing just completed our markups. And, you know, as we're talking about, I'm gonna cheat and try to jump back to the previous subject, but, you know, as we're talking about criminal justice reform, we put in some language through our appropriations committee to try to implement what is in legislation like the Justice in Policing Act. And I want to give kudos to Congressman Meeks, Chairwoman Karen Bass, and the Congressional Black Caucus for spearheading long overdue legislation in Congress that would provide really simple first steps like banning the chokehold, ending these no-knock warrants, for example, legislation that is not necessarily new, but is long overdue. And so there is still a lot to be done in Congress. We really, on behalf of the American people, beg Mitch McConnell to please pass the HEROES Act.
Thank you. And Congressman Meeks, I suppose any disagreement there, or does it seem like it's on the Senate Republicans at this point? I think you're on mute. Sorry, if you could come off.
Grace is absolutely 100% correct. It is all on, you know, I call McConnell the Undertaker because all of these bills that we have that in the Senate, he tries to bury them and kill them. But there's too much at stake for the American people. And I think that what McConnell will feel now, because, you know, we've heard the Republicans and the president and many in some of the southern red states, they were saying, oh, we can open up, everything is fine. And now they're paying the price for it. And so they will see that their states and their cities are going to suffer as a result economically and financially. So therefore holding up the aid that cities and municipalities need has to free up. And we need to do it based upon what our population was so that we can make sure our city and state gets the dollars that it needs, tremendously important. And so McConnell and the Senate, that, you know, and then I'll just close on this because I know there's so much to talk about, but, you know, as we get to the end of July, when individuals, when the rents become due again. So the opportunities to make sure that people have the availability to pay their rent is important. We put it in the HEROES Act and in a set-aside bill, $110 billion for vouchers for people to pay their rent, $75 billion for those who have mortgages and been affected so they can pay their mortgage. This helps all the way. It helps the person so they're not evicted from their homes or their apartment. It helps the landlords, especially the small landlords, because, you know, in places like Southeastern Queens, many individuals own two-family homes. They're dependent upon the rent to pay their mortgage, and when that doesn't happen. So we can help both sides. That's why we've got to get this bill through. That's why pressure's got to be put on McConnell so that we can make sure that we keep and keep hope alive for people, average, everyday good people like the people here in Queens County.
That brings to mind, I know that the state rental assistance program is going online tomorrow. I believe New Yorkers can apply starting on Thursday. Just wondering if anybody has been briefed on that, understands it, and whether that program is enough for New Yorkers or whether there needs to be more action.
I can talk about that a little bit. I think it's a great start. I commend the governor, the state assembly, and the state senate for passing that legislation. The program, as I understand it, would only help about 50,000 New Yorkers though. So while I think it is important, I think a lot more needs to be done. Part of that stems from the HEROES Act being passed. And as we saw with coronavirus, especially here in Queens, and Greg mentioned it before, it really also, I know you want me to be optimistic, but it really highlighted a lot of the disparities and the inequities that people in our home borough of Queens have faced, whether it's public transportation, whether it's lack of hospital beds. We saw lines at food pantries go around blocks and blocks right in our small neighborhoods. And so we have to make sure that we are addressing this. And the first step is through passing the HEROES Act. I think I saw a question, sorry I peeked, in the chat about what we can do to help the Senate pass legislation. You know, there are even Republican mayors across the country begging Mitch McConnell to pass the HEROES Act. Some of them might not get any federal funding like New York City normally does, and they're depending on this legislation. And so we just need to amp up the public pressure. And sadly, even because COVID is happening more and more at an increasing rate in certain red states, for example, I believe that the pressure is ramping up.
And I'll just add to that, Jeff. You know, this was the debate in the whole budget this year, right? I mean, what are our priorities as a city? Is it funding over policing our communities, or is it reinvesting back into these communities that are hurt? And when you look at, for instance, how the affordable housing budget was slashed, I believe, by $1 billion, we talk about a time where we're going to see, once these courts start opening up, we're going to see an immense amount of people being pushed into this court system. And guess what? Homelessness is going to balloon, as it is now. So, you know, we as a city also, and this is, I know we're on the line with our federal partners. That's why the stimulus package is so important, because we need this assistance to come down to the city so we can find rental assistance, so we can do housing vouchers, how we can expand these programs to really prevent what we're seeing in the streets now. As you talk about the correlation between the disparities in violence, it's a clear indication that the city needs to do more in these communities. And then I'll add on two other big points. For homeowners specifically, you know, people think homeowners are rich, or there's this notion of that. But in Southeast Queens, for instance, you know, people are living check to check. So you got to think about foreclosure prevention and foreclosure assistance, which we were able to, I believe, put in about $10 million in the budget this year around. But it's still not enough when you think about the entire city. So we're going to have people being pushed back into foreclosures, even as we started to dig ourselves out of this hole in South Queens. So those are some challenges ahead.
Sure thing. Now I've got to push us along to talking about the election and the fact that they're still counting ballots at the New York City Board of Elections. Specifically wondering about the number of rejected mail-in ballots. Question, I guess, particularly for Congressman Meeks. You know, is this something that Queens residents and New Yorkers should be concerned about, the number of mail-in ballots that are being rejected, particularly based on the fact that it seems that there's higher rejection rates in communities that have more Black voters and more Latino voters, and lower rejection rates in those with white voters?
Well, we definitely have to get better at it. There's no question. You know, we have to be mindful that this wasn't an emergency situation. That when we did all of these absentee ballots, the governor came up with something expeditiously that we need to review. I mean, because I think most of the problems with a number of the ballots that were rejected Either they were not signed or they were not put back in an envelope. You had to request the affidavit ballots, and then you got back the ballot, and then you had certain procedures. We have to simplify it. It was too complicated, too cumbersome. And so now we've got an opportunity to look at that so that we can simplify it and make it better. I know the state legislature had a bill that they were passing before we had the crisis to make mail-in ballots more simple for folks and make it easier for them so that their vote counts. It's important for people's votes to count. This was complicated. We've learned that. Hopefully we have time for the state to fix it, and the governor, if it requires an executive order, to change it so that we can have a more simplified process and do better in November and future elections.
So you're thinking that there would be time before the November election to correct this in some way, to make sure that more people's votes get counted?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, even if we look at the process where maybe you just send the ballots out and let folks, send it in and be more explicit. And I know we all will have a job for folks to make sure you have to have a signature, etc. You have to make sure it's a system that you can have that has integrity in it, so that you don't have any fraud possibilities. So that's what you're balancing one against the other. But we then would have to get out in an information campaign to make sure that we're educating individuals on what to do is and what not to do. But with all these envelopes, and if you're not in the envelope, and you got to check off the right box, that's complicated for a lot of folks, especially seniors. So we've got to simplify it, and I think that we have the time to do that. And I hope and I do believe we can get it done.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Now, this is a panel about the future of Queens. We've gotten some pushback both in the Q&A and on Twitter before, questioning, basically people were wondering, is the future of Queens actually more democratic socialists and more progressive politicians? I know all of you identify as progressives, certainly, but you're not part of this new crop of democratic socialists specifically, and outsiders to that group. Would you agree with that the future of Queens is these outsider politicians and a more left-leaning style, or is the future different than that?
You want me to address that?
Yeah. I'll take. Let's get another voice in there first, but I definitely want to hear from you on that.
So, go ahead, Congresswoman.
I'll start. Look, Jeff, there's no outsider. I started out as an outsider in Queens politics. I started out as an insurgent. Our jobs, we are only better because we become better listeners, and we want to be more inclusive. And the goal at the end of the day is to have as many people participate as possible. And our goal is the same, to better the lives of the people of Queens. And so whether that's to reform the election process, I know that in New York, even though it was unfortunately during a pandemic, we're thrilled at being able to vote by mail, but that's a right. That shouldn't be a luxury. And so Greg's right, the state legislature hopefully is addressing through some of these more archaic laws by passing legislation. But the goal is to restore faith in democracy. There are a lot of outsiders. There are a lot of new people. After I won't get too political, but after President Trump was elected, we heard from so many new people in our districts, people who, regardless of age, might never have voted before, might never have participated. And we met with so many, and we continue to meet new people. And that's part of our job. And that's part of why, we will keep working together to improve the lives of the people of Queens. But there's no outsiders. We all have a common goal to work as effectively as possible to bring resources back to our district.
Yeah, look, from my perspective, I found it interesting. And as you all were talking about the campaign and the counting of the votes this year, I was sort of happy that I wasn't involved in that conversation. It was very different a year ago. But you can't, and before I get into that question, you can't argue with the transparency of the process. You know, when I was going through this last year, and I can't talk for this year, but last year we were opening ballots and opening envelopes with like camera crews and 10 people tweeting at once and Facebook reporters. And I mean, everyone was right there with huge cameras watching every single vote. So, you know, the transparency is sort of unquestionable. And, you know, I'd like to add to what Congresswoman Meng said. Yeah, I started in elected office running against the organization. So 27 years ago, I was 10 when I started. I was running against the Queens County organization, which, by the way, are elected officials and district leaders and people who care deeply about their communities. And, you know, I've run a few times with the Democratic Party's backing, and I've run as an insurgent several times. I think that you got to look at where Queens County is. We are still a borough of families. We are still a borough that cares deeply about our communities. I think that, you know, one day you're running with people, the next day, you know, you might not be on the same side. And I think that's okay. I think that brings a lot of new and different ideas to the process. I think what a lot of these new organizations have done is made national conversations out of fairness and justice and equity. And whether you're on the same side or not on certain issues, at least people are talking about it. And I think that is a great bonus for this country. So I think the future of Queens is going to be, at least in elected office, who the people choose. But, you know, at the end of the day, we all want the same things, which is great, you know, great community and great borough for ourselves, our families, the people we care about deeply, and to make sure that their futures can be here in this borough. And I think that's an important conversation to have. We want people who are here who believe in the freedoms that this borough offers and the conversations that we have in the 200 languages that we all represent. It is what makes us the borough that we are, that diversity. And so I wouldn't want to change that. But I do think the conversations are always good to have, always.
Let me say, I first ran against the county organization. I think all of us may have started that. I was not the county's choice when I first ran for the assembly and the city council. You know, but here I am now as the chair. What it is diversity of ideas, and things evolve and people evolve. And you sit down and you talk together and you work together. You try to figure things out. That's why I said in my initial statement that I want to be the unifier. So that in politics, what you find is that, you know, no one gets everything of what they want. We are a borough of communities, and communities have different interests, and we got to make sure that everybody has a say and have their word in it. And that's what these elections are all about. So it is diversity, not only diversity with reference to ethnicity, but diversity with reference to ideas, which is important. That makes us a stronger borough. That's why I'm optimistic about it, because we have all of that diversity. Diversity with reference to ideas, diversity with reference to ethnicity, diversity with reference to religion, and we all are putting it together. And we do have this back and forth, which is good. That's what a democracy is all about. And once the people have decided who they want to represent them, it's my job as the Queens County leader to work and try to work with everybody, no matter what. So I don't believe people try to put me or get me I'm a this person or I'm a that person. No, I'm a Queens person who wants to try to work together. I think that part of my job is what I wanted to do when I was an insurgent. I wanted to be a part of it so that I could have my voice on it, and I can try to then influence it in that regard. And I think that's what we want, and that's what we will continue to do, which will make us grow and be a stronger borough as a result of it.
I'll chime in on this, and Greg could get a good laugh at this, because I've always been sort of the insurgent from my inception. Coming into politics in 2003, I worked for a guy by the name of James Sanders for a decade. I don't think there's, you know, anybody who's been on the other side certainly longer than me. But let me just add, you know, part of the problem we find in Queens is people don't respect history. They just see one thing and that's it. And you know, as Greg alluded to, everybody on this line has been an insurgent to a great degree. And this is my first time obviously being supported by the Democratic organization in the history of my career, technically. But one thing I appreciate, and when Greg got in, it was great because Greg really spoke about diversity, talked about ensuring that everybody had a seat at the table, whatever grudges we might have held against each other for 2 years or so, that went out the window because it was about the collective of what we needed to achieve for the entire borough. People keep getting caught up in these titles, establishment, progressive. You know, our constituents don't give a damn about that. What they want to know, as I just left the Rockaways outside of one of my housing developments, what they want to know is that they can sit outside without getting shot. What people in this borough want to know is that we can create jobs, that the housing is affordable. They want to know that they can remain in this borough. They want to see growth in the borough as well. Those are the conversations that my constituents are talking about. They don't get caught up in these titles. And I think we hurt ourselves getting caught up in these titles. Iron does sharpen iron, for sure. So we may all have the same objective. You may have a different way of getting there. I may have a different way of getting there. But at the end of the day, one of the things that's being lost in politics is that we can't sit down and have a conversation. It's just an us versus them. And listen, nobody can take away from my experience as a young Black male coming from this community who got started because my friend was murdered in these streets, because I was stopped and frisked, who now has come chairing the Public Safety Committee now, redeveloping the Rockaways after the storm. You'll never hear people debate the record around the housing and the investments that we brought into underserved communities in this borough, but there is always this tension of, well, he's the establishment candidate. What I say to people is do your homework. And it shouldn't even be about that. It should be about what are we doing to truly improve the lives of everyday Queens residents in this borough. I love Greg Meeks.
We've only got 10 minutes left, so I'm going to have to ask everyone to, you know, not exactly lightning round, but let's keep it quick so we can hit a few more questions here. One in particular is the Queens healthcare system. We saw Elmhurst Hospital, Jamaica Hospital, St. John's Episcopal. A lot of these hospitals were hit so hard during the coronavirus crisis, especially when, you know, at the top of the curve. We might see a second curve. Even if we don't, we're certain to see, you know, future crises like this. Is the answer in Queens more hospitals, more emergency rooms, or is the answer something else, better coordination, whatever it may be? And we'll start with Congresswoman Mang, please, who I believe represents the area around Elmhurst Hospital.
Sure. Well, first I want to say, I mentioned this a little bit before, but my constituents are essential workers who worked at places like Elmhurst Hospital. They were the ones that first sounded the alarm, not just to New York, but to the country, what our most urgent and dire needs were. For example, lack of PPE, lack of ventilators. And so I wanted to thank the good essential workers of the borough of Queens because they really helped save lives around the country. Yes, you know, it's a multifaceted answer. One of them is to provide more funding for our hospitals. We've done that through various pieces of legislation passed in the past few months. We've brought millions back to our hospitals right here in Queens. But however, if you look at the number of people who died from COVID, the majority of them had underlying conditions, pre-existing conditions already, which meant that they weren't getting the health care that they needed to get prior to COVID happening. So whether it was the fact that they did not have health insurance, whether it was the fact that we didn't have invest enough in our communities, like healthcare centers, for example, we need more of those so that they can have more preventative care rather than having those underlying conditions, God forbid, if COVID ever happened again.
Yeah, and I would like to just build upon that if I can. I think the Congresswoman is absolutely correct. I mean, when COVID hit, I had just become the district attorney. I was only there like 2 months or 3 months. So a lot of people still called me and reached out to me, although Borough President Sharon Lee has been amazing in taking a lot of these issues on and working really diligently for the people of Queens County. But I was also getting a lot of calls from people that I've dealt with in the past. And our private hospitals, you know, we have HHC, we have Elmhurst and Queens hospitals who work every day with HHC and with the city, but we also have a lot of private hospitals that were underwater. They were drowning. You know, Jamaica Hospital, Flushing Hospital, St. John's. I mean, just these private hospitals that were just drowning and really needed help. And the professionalism, the compassion, and the caring in which these workers at these hospitals committed themselves to the people of Queens County was extraordinary during extraordinary times. And, you know, Queens has faced quite a few of these, you know, like we had Superstorm Sandy when, you know, Queens had to come together, and sometimes we were like, hey, we're over here, you know, and people had to come together and work together. And hopefully, I think your question was about the future. Hopefully this has prepared us better in our hospitals to coordinate. Hopefully we get the services and the tools that we need to deal with them in the future. And hopefully this has taught us a lot about what to do when future issues happen. We hope we never have to deal with it, but we do have to prepare for it. Jeff, let me thank City and State. I apologize, but thank you for the opportunity.
And thank you so much for joining us.
I know it's a lightning round, Jeff. Just let me just say it real quick. We also have to make sure that we take care of, because you know it's more difficult. Because I do believe we need more health care. I know in southeastern Queens we've been talking about trying to get another hospital. We've seen a number of them closed previously, but we have to make sure we fund our federally funded community health care centers, who are in the heart of a lot of the poor communities. Because Grace Ming is exactly right. They're not getting the health care that they need before COVID. And so if we are funding the community health care centers and making sure that they are taking care of a lot of the underlying problems to prevent them from happening, the best way to make sure people are healthy is prevention. That's why before in the Affordable Care Act, there was a large number of dollars going to prevention, so that you don't do, you know, you pay a lot more after someone gets sick than if you can help them before they get sick. So I just wanted to throw something in there about the community health care centers. I think they're extremely important that we focus and make sure they stay strong.
Yeah, thank you.
And Jeff, I don't know if I could jump in on that. Access is also important, right? You know, Greg and I represent a community that has a food desert, right? And when we talk about access to a supermarket, I mean, there are people in our community who have to travel 2 to 3 miles to get to their newest supermarket. Thanks to our work collectively, you know, we're using zoning as a tool to shape the Rockaways in a way that's responsible, that allows growth, but also resolves a lot of these issues that have creating the underlying issues for many of our poorer residents. So for instance, we're doing the largest affordable housing project, I think, in the private rezoning in the Rockaways. I think it's the largest private site rezoning in the city under the de Blasio administration. But one of the first things we pushed for was a new supermarket. So we have about a 30,000 square foot supermarket coming right across the street from public housing residents, who now will have access to that rather than having McDonald's and Taco Bell on every corner. So the question becomes access, and how do we leverage public-private partnership to make sure that we're building out more institutions, and also ensuring that we can solve a lot of the policy and budgetary issues that many of our communities have faced. So that's just something I wanted to add.
Sure, and just to follow up on that, I mean, if elected borough president, you'll have a lot of say on land use. You know, does Queens need more hospitals, or do you think there are enough right now?
No, absolutely not. There's not enough. I mean, you look at the growth around the borough. I mean, the Rockaways is booming. Long Island City, you know, there's the proposal around Sunnyside Yards. You have the Amazon site. And you look at what happened in Elmhurst. You look at what happened at St. John's. We're busting at the seams. So this has a question to do. The question is, what are we going to invest in as a city? Once again, what are our priorities? And as we look to our federal partners, as stimulus dollars come down, there obviously will be some opportunities, I believe, moving into the future to really shape our borough. But it's really about leveraging these opportunities. When you look at Sunnyside, when you look at the waterfront in the Rockaways, I know we're having a conversation with the Health and Hospitals Corporation already about a new facility out there. It could be the first city hospital, you know, out in the Rockaways. But we have to leverage these opportunities as development happens in our borough.
Thank you so much. And I just want to say to everybody watching, we have 51 questions in the Q&A right now. And I've read them all. I really wish we could get all of them.
They're all for Greg Meeks.
I'm trying to get some. I'm going to try and get one quick question in that we can get in before the end of our time. A lot of people are asking about transportation, the MTA. Look, I know it's easy to say that the MTA needs more money. I think we can pretty much all agree with that. But can I get one idea from each of you in how to help commuters in the short term? You know, as people start, either people currently during the coronavirus pandemic, or once people start, more people start going to work again. What's the answer here? What's a way to make commuting either safer or easier for Queens residents? And we'll start with Congresswoman Mang, please.
I know we started to have these conversations in Queens, for example, with the bus redesign process, which is obviously on hold for a bit. But we need to take a closer look at that. Those initial proposals were not something that were very favorable to my district, but those are the necessary conversations that we need to be having to make sure that, speaking of access, how more people have easier access to public transportation, especially in my part of the borough. There are even proposals being floated nationally about free or lower cost public transportation. And I know that seems like a dream, but that is something that I think we should take a closer look at as well. And forgive me, I am trying to peek back and forth at these chat questions. I'm sorry, I violated the rules. And I know that there are some people who are not satisfied with the guests that are on today's show. And I want to tell you, don't blame city and state. I'm happy to go on with any guest, from the DSA folks to Republicans, to everyone in between. I'm always happy to go on and to try to finish answering the other 51 questions. Thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you. And AOC, if you're watching, come on next. Yep. Congressman Meeks, very briefly, one great way to help commuters in the short term.
Yeah, I think that also we need to look at some of the rails and the connections, some of the existing structure that we have that's not being utilized, and utilize it. That's something that we can do rather quickly and make sure they interconnect, because they surely go to other parts of the borough, to Rockaways, to other parts of Grace Ming's district, and they're just tracks that are there. We can bring that back and utilize it and make it part of the system, and that would help also with transportation quickly. That's just a quick answer for you.
Thank you. And finally, Councilmember Richards, one quick answer for how to make commuting better in the short term.
I think we would be foolish not to look at bike infrastructure at this point. I'm seeing such an uptick of people riding bikes, even in Southeast Queens, and people don't think people ride bikes in Southeast Queens for some reason. And we had to check DOT, the Department of Transportation, on leaving us out of some of their particular initiatives and programs. But we're going to have to look at this, because people, when you look at the buses, they are overcrowded. Obviously, the number one thing would be to ensure that we have more frequent service. I agree with Congressman Meeks on using the LIRR. We need to see the Atlantic ticket extended into Penn Station permanently, so that people can get on our commuter rail lines and get into Manhattan in a half an hour, especially the people furthest on the outskirts from Manhattan. So there's a lot of opportunities there, but I do think we should look at bike infrastructure. It's controversial in some communities, but I think we're going to have to be bold and really look at these.
All right, now everybody here, please, if you're interested in digital technology, City and State is having a webinar next Thursday with a keynote from New York City Do It Commissioner Jessica Tisch. Gail Brewer is going to be there too, so it's going to be great. Check that out at cityandstateny.com. It's free, a free digital tech New York webinar. And with that, thank you so much to our panelists for joining us. Congressman Greg Meeks, Congresswoman Grace Mang, and New York City Councilmember Donovan Richards, presumptive borough president. We'll see what happens when the votes are counted. But thank you so much for joining us and answering as many questions as we could today. Again, I've got a lot of questions in the chat. I know I'm going to be asking you guys in future interviews. And most of all, thank you to all of our viewers today who joined City and State for this webinar about the future of Queens. So join us again next time. We're going to do one for each of the boroughs. And go Mets.
Congratulations, Frank Joseph, too, if you're on. Go Mets. Thank you, Congressman Meeks.
Thank you. Thank you, future borough president.
Jeff. Bye, Grace.
Bye, everyone.
Great to see you. All right. Bye. Bye. Be
Thanks
safe.
for sponsoring, Rodney. Thanks for
You're
being
welcome.
a sponsor.